Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see innovative and new ideas around prevention. And I just want to acknowledge two of my co-authors, Mark Boys and Lorraine Scher, who are sitting here, and two of my colleagues, Pat Lim-Arken and Tom Fenn from UNICEF. Much of the thinking you'll see here has come from various hotel bars in Nairobi and Joburg and Geneva as we've talked to policymakers around the world about these new ideas. So this research is really research designed for science to inform policy, and it's been designed as a collaboration with policymakers, big NGOs, our teen advisory group at the bottom there, and the South African and US government. And most of the findings I'm going to report to you today come from a national longitudinal study we've just finished. Essentially, we chose 3 provinces on disparate parts of South Africa. Within each province, we selected 1 urban and 1 health district with high HIV prevalence. Within each health district, we randomly selected census enumeration areas, and then we interviewed every single household with a teenager in those areas. I'm happy to answer any methods questions, but that's the overall story. Oh, and a year later, in 2 provinces, we followed them up. So we've got a 97% follow-up rate in 2 of the provinces. We ran out of money in the other province, which is why we didn't do that one. So we did a design of questionnaire that was really aimed and designed with our teen advisory group to engage teenagers and to help them talk a little bit more freely about some of the awkward and embarrassing things that are difficult to speak about in this. And really, I think that we'd started off by thinking that we were going to see behavioral predictors of sexual risk behavior. We'd looked at HIV knowledge and things like that. But increasingly, what we were finding was that the predictors of HIV risk behavior were structural predictors. And if you look to the left here, you can see that a girl in a healthy family who's not abused and has enough to eat 5 days a week has a just under 1% chance of having transactional sex. If you look to the right, you can see that a girl with an AIDS-sick parent, not enough to eat, and who's abused, has a 57% chance of having transactional sex. So that leads us to think, if these are the predictors of HIV risk behavior, well, what should we be thinking about in terms of prevention? Well, around this time, some interesting studies were coming out of the World Bank. And this was a study where they used cash incentives to reduce HIV risk in Tanzania. This was amongst young adults. And then a very interesting study around the same time where they compared conditional cash transfers to unconditional cash transfers for young women in Malawi. And they found that the conditional ones and the unconditional ones both worked in reducing HIV risk and HIV incidence. So just around the time we were doing our study in South Africa, the South African government were moving the child support grant, which is a national child-focused grant. It's about $20 a month for the whole family, and it's shared out amongst the whole family. It's poverty alleviation. It's not really aimed at risk reduction. And they were scaling it up from going up to age 14 to going up to age 18. So this was an amazing opportunity because only about half the teens in our sample by this point were actually receiving the scaled up grant. So we asked, does getting an unconditional national government cash transfer reduce HIV risk behavior? Well, the answer surprised us because for adolescent girls who get a child support grant in their family, we see a 50% odds reduction in risk of transactional sex and a 70% odds reduction in a risk of age-disparate sex. So that's sex with a sexual partner more than 5 years older than them. So in 2 key HIV risk behaviors, we're seeing a real change from a cash transfer. But we're also seeing some things that it doesn't do. It doesn't work for boys. It doesn't work for other HIV risk behaviors like multiple partners, sex without a condom, sex when drunk or on drugs. What these cash transfers seem to be doing, or what they're not doing, is changing the kind of dumb stuff that teenagers do. What they seem to be doing is providing teenage girls with the capacity to make decisions about who they have sex with. They're not necessarily needing to have a boyfriend who can pay their school fees or bring home groceries for their families. They're choosing far more consistently to have sex with younger boys who are much lower risk of HIV infection. But around this time, we presented this at the ICASA meeting in Cape Town. And David Wilson from the World Bank, who has a capacity to hone into the heart of the problem, said, well, this is all very well, but it's not doing anything for boys, and it's not answering all the problem. So we really went back to the drawing board, and we thought back to child development literature and adolescent development literature. What could we add to cash transfers to maximize their benefits? And one of the potential things that we see, particularly from things like the adverse childhood experiences studies in the US, is that potentially adding social care might provide a benefit. I mean, we didn't know at this point. So what we looked at essentially was whether cash and cash plus care could reduce incidence rates of these known HIV-risk behaviors in South Africa. So we'd measured a whole set of different kinds of interventions, not actually expecting to use them for this. I mean, these were all given to us by UNICEF and USAID and the South African government. And if you look to the left-hand side, you can see they're the cash interventions from food gardens down to school transport. And on the right-hand side are the care interventions from home-based carers through down to teacher support. We then had to, unfortunately, reduce the ones that were received by under 100 adolescents in the sample. And we were left with food gardens, child-focused grants, and free school meals for cash, and positive parenting and teacher support for care. Well, again, the findings surprised us. We found that for girls, getting cash alone reduced incidence of risk behavior by around 40% odds reduction. If you added cash to care, you got a maximized benefit with about a 50% odds reduction. For boys, we saw an even stronger effect. We see that cash alone has no significant impact on HIV risk reduction, but cash plus care gives a 50% odds reduction. This wasn't actually what we were expecting at all. You know, the boys we'd interviewed were cool guys in the townships, but it really seems that getting the psychosocial care, either good parenting or teacher support, plus the cash transfer benefit, was really producing a maximized benefit for boys. But really, once we were thinking about this, it didn't seem to be enough. We were thinking about social protection, in a sense, as like a black box. You put social protection in, cash and care, and you get out HIV risk reduction. But what was going on? What were the mechanisms? How was this working? And to try to understand this, we built a structural model to try and really get a sense around how social protection was working. And what we found was we looked at 2011 predictors of 2012 risk behavior incidents. And we found that the strongest predictors of our risk behavior were structural deprivation. They were hunger, community violence, parents being sick with HIV/AIDS, and living in an informal settlement. We then looked and found that those structural factors weren't directly inputting into HIV risk behavior. They were going indirectly. In a sense, what was happening was that the structural drivers were producing a set of psychosocial risks in the family and in the individual, which were then leading on to HIV risk behavior. And for this, we use something called multiple moderated multiple mediation analysis in process. If you've got any questions about it, Mark Boyes is sitting in the 4th row. So then we asked, how do cash and care input into this? And what we found, if you look at the black lines, you can see that both cash and care directly reduce psychosocial problems and directly reduce risk behavior incidents. But if you look at the red lines, you see that something else is happening as well. Those red lines show a moderation or an interaction effect. And they show that for the most vulnerable adolescents, for those most structurally deprived and those with the most psychosocial problems, cash and care are having a maximized benefit. They work best for the most vulnerable. And just some very new work that we're starting to doing. I mean, this was presented in Johannesburg about a week and a half ago to a group of 7 countries' finance, social development, and health senior government officials. And one of the key questions that they asked of this was, what exactly should we be doing? This is fantastic and interesting conceptually, but which programs should we be introducing? And we've really just started to do some work on this. And this is one of the findings that we've just recently seen. And we're looking at specific interventions and combinations of interventions. And this just shows adolescents with multiple sexual partners incidence. And if you look to the left, you can see that an adolescent with no support, about 20% of them have multiple past year partners. If you just give them a cash transfer, that goes down to about 10%. If you give them a cash transfer plus a highly supportive teacher, it's down to about 7.5%, and a cash transfer plus just good parenting gives you about 5.5%. But the combination of all three, a cash transfer, teacher support, and positive parenting, reduces the incidence of multiple past year sexual partners from 20% to 1.4%. I think we're starting to see something really positive here in terms of prevention opportunities. So what are our key messages? We can see that unconditional government cash transfers delivered in the real world of sub-Saharan Africa reduce adolescent HIV risk. We can see that adding cash to care gives greater effects, and that together they mitigate structural risk pathways. We can see cumulative impacts of 2 or more interventions, and crucially, we can see that in the messy context, in the real world, these do seem to work. So thank you to our funders, and thank you to you.
So we've got a couple. We've got a few minutes for clarification, technical questions. Anyone would like? Yep.
Hi, Lucy. Do you have any suggestions for the child support grant in South Africa? Do we not need to increase it? Would more money not be better?
It's a great question. So this is an interesting question. This is actually something that policymakers are asking a lot. They're asking how much money should we be giving, and who should we be giving it to? And I think that the child support grant can tell us 2 things. It can tell us that giving the money to the family, to the household, seems to have a really strong effect. We don't yet know whether it helps to give the money directly to adolescents, but it seems that that really may not be necessary, which is good because it's much harder to give money to adolescents who don't have bank accounts and things like that. In terms of how much money, we actually don't know. The only study that's compared amount of money was the Tanzania study. That was a different kind. It was a cash incentive study. But there they found no effects for $10 a quarter, and they did find effects for $20 a quarter, which suggests that there is some differentiation effect. But we don't know with unconditional social protection. What I think it can tell us very clearly, though, is that moving the age of receipt up has made a difference. If we stop social protection at age 14, we're actually missing the most at-risk group, which is the 14 to 18 or 14 to 20 age group that we really should be focusing on. So I think that it can tell us.
Okay, we've got another question at the front.
Wonderful presentation, thank you. I just wanted to know better, to understand better, what do you mean by good parenting and teacher support? So to qualify it a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, that's a great question. So we measured good parenting using the Alabama Parenting Questionnaire, which is a standardized questionnaire, and we looked specifically at positive parenting and parental monitoring. They're the 2 types of parenting that look like they most reduce youth risk behavior. For teacher support, we measured it using a standardized social support questionnaire, looking at different kinds of support. Interestingly, support from a religious leader didn't seem to have the same effect as teacher support. But I think what's more interesting is how does that lead on to interventions? Because this was probably naturally occurring good support and good parenting. Well, what's good news is that there are interventions being tested and existing. So for teacher support, the Regional Psychosocial Support Initiative is just finishing up a randomized control trial of a teacher sensitization project to improve teacher capacity to give support. They're doing that in Zambia and Kenya and Tanzania. In terms of parenting, there are very strong evidence of parenting programs and particularly building skills amongst parents to work with adolescents in reducing youth risk behavior, reducing abuse, reducing those kind of problems. They've got very good effect sizes in the developed world, in high-income countries, and there's new studies testing them in low and middle-income countries with some positive initial results. So I think we do have at least very strong emergent evidence of interventions which can improve these things. It was a long answer to a short question, sorry.